Hi, and welcome to our group's presentation on social media regulations. Our team members are Tala, Poye, Jason, and myself, Sebastian. We're going to be discussing social media and how it is regulated. Social media has become incredibly intertwined into our daily lives. Globally, it is currently being used by 3.6 billion people, or around half of the world's population. It has become increasingly difficult to avoid using it. Naturally, as with all parts of our lives, regulations have been put in place which are aimed to prevent the abuse of social media. In this presentation, we will be talking about these regulations, especially with regard to the EU and United States, their pros and cons, as well as an example of their breach and how it was dealt with. These regulations have been largely designed to prevent the spread of misinformation, harmful, copyrighted or extremist content, as well as to prevent social media companies from storing and misusing information about their users without consent. As with all things in life, regulation on social media is not black and white. There are many pros and cons, as well as people arguing both for increased and decreased regulations. Uh, on the one hand, there are people arguing that increased safety online is the way to go, and on the other hand, there are arguments for freedom of speech to be made as well, which we will discuss in greater detail in the presentation. We hope to present both sides of the argument in our presentation so that you, the viewer, can make up your own mind for or against increased regulations. The EU has a very strong stance with regards to regulating social media. This is especially true with regard to content deemed as hateful, misinformative, or which may infringe on copyrights, as well as the misuse of data by social media companies. While on the surface these might seem like no-brainers, it isn't always so simple, and there have been plenty of criticism to many of these points. On the topic of hate speech, the EU has an incredibly strict stance against the use of hate speech on social media. In a lot of cases, so much so that it is considered to be illegal, with fines and even prison time as a punishment. Hate speech is defined by the EU as anything that incites violence and hatred against protected groups. This definition is incredibly vague, and as such it is often left to the discretion of the person enforcing the regulation to whether something someone said is considered hate speech. This can have many problems as there is little transparency as to how this regulation is enforced, especially when it is the social media company itself performing the audit. While social media companies claim that anywhere from 17 to 30% of content reported by users is deemed as hate speech, it is often difficult to determine the intent behind what someone says. Therefore, many claim that these regulations can be abused, whether maliciously or by mistake. As an example, in 2015, the French Supreme Court fined 12 pro-Palestinian activists €12,000 for wearing t-shirts saying "Boycott Israel." Without getting into the complexity of the topic, one can argue that it is in violation of freedom of speech. This brings the old saying into mind that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. On the topic of misinformation, with the emergence of a global pandemic, the EU has also took an even stricter stance on the spread of misinformation, especially in regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. Social media has to ensure that the spread of content deemed misinformative is prevented. This is accomplished by making social media remove the content creator's ability to generate advertising revenue, or by removing the content outright. While some of this misinformative content is obviously bogus, such as the conspiracy that COVID-19 is a hoax and that the real killer is 5G cell towers, one may argue that the spread of such misinformation should still fall under freedom of speech. An example that comes to mind is the conspiracy that the United States government was purposefully and illegally subjecting citizens, both in and outside of the US, to hallucinogens, sensory deprivation, as well as other forms of torture and abuse to study their effects. This was considered a crazy conspiracy in 1975 until documents declassified in 2001 ended up confirming everything in the Operation MKUltra. Thus, many argue that the spread of information and ideas should not be hindered, regardless of whether it is true or not, and that information should be judged based on the merit of its claim rather than governmental regulations. Now onto the topic of copyright and Article 13. To tackle copyright infringements, the EU has introduced a new regulation, dubbed Article 13. Article 13 makes social media companies liable to pay for damages for hosting copyright content uploaded by users. While on the surface, this seems like a positive. The fine print of the regulation implies that the users would have to prove that they own the rights to their own content. This would be incredibly detrimental to small content creators, especially independent journalists. They would not be able to cite articles from major news outlets without being liable to paying for copyright and licensing fees, which would normally fall under fair use. This would cripple small creators without access to major financial backing, and as such, could limit their freedom of speech when reporting on news. Article 13 had major backlash from both from social media companies as well as citizens of the EU. 170,000 protesters broke out across the entire EU, including 30,000 people protesting in Berlin. There is, however, also a case to be made for copyright protection, which will be discussed shortly. Despite how people may feel about these regulations, they are in many ways necessary. I will now pass you on to my good friend Tala, who will talk in more detail about how regulations, in particularly the EU regulations, can be necessary.
Regulations are a very important part of social media, as it prevents fraud and it's supposed to make sure the companies protect users from content involving things like violence, terrorism, cyberbullying, and child abuse. Companies must ensure that harmful content is removed and not displayed on any social media in the first place. Social media platforms face fines if they do not delete extremist video content within an hour. Over $126 million in fines have been issued to companies violating GDPR as of January 2020. Social media platforms must comply with regulations as it could get them in legal troubles. Regulations bring positive changes that could be beneficial for social media users and developers. The European Union introduced the General Data Protection Regulations (GDPR) in May 2018, which sets rules on how companies, including social media platforms, store and use people's data and also take action on copyrights. Simply, businesses can't collect or process the data of consumers without consent. The Data Protection Act requires fair processing of personal data, which means that companies must be very clear about why they are collecting personal data and how they are going to use it. The law also states that if the company uses browser cookies on the website, they need to clearly explain what the purpose of those cookies are and why they are using them, and without user consent, companies can get into legal troubles. The data privacy laws also applies within EU when creating content for a website, for example. Legal notices like terms and services, cookies, notifications, and privacy policies. For example, blog posts might be a lot of fun to write, but neglecting to give away your readers the right information can also get you in legal troubles. For example, Facebook has been one of the biggest abusers of personal privacy in recent past, quoting the Cambridge incident. Jason will highlight this in more details later. Facebook announced that they have become GDPR compliant in terms of their global privacy settings, but they had to solve their facial recognition software in Europe after GDPR, and it was a tool for them for privacy protection. China is the world's biggest social media market, but the access to websites such as Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and other foreigner internet companies are blocked in China. Most people can only use domestic social media sites such as Weibo, Renren, and Youku. The Great Firewall in China prevents internet users from viewing or posting socially or politically sensitive content. Chinese law prohibits any online publication and transmission of false information that may disturb the economy or social order. Social media platforms must maintain a license to operate businesses in China. Users are also required to register their real information for example names and other identity information with service providers.
In the United States, net neutrality is the principle that Internet service providers treat all data on the Internet the same and not discriminate. Net neutrality prevents Internet service providers from slowing some traffic or charging a premium fee for other traffic. Under the Communication Act of 1934, Internet service providers are classified under two titles: one, information service, and two, common carrier service. The classification affects the Federal Communications Commission's authority over Internet service providers. The FCC would have significant ability to regulate Internet service providers if classified as Title II common carrier, but would have little control over them if classified as Title I. The FCC Common Carrier Regulation, Section 230, says that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. In other words, online intermediaries that host or republish speech are protected against a range of law that might otherwise be used to hold them legally responsible for what others say and do. The protection intermediaries include not only regular Internet service provider but also a range of interactive computer service providers, including basically any online service that publishes third-party content. Though they are important exceptions for certain criminal and intellectual property-based claims like copyright. The Communication Decency Act 230 creates a broad protection that has allowed innovation and free speech online to flourish. This legal and policy work frame has allowed for YouTube Vimeo users to upload their online videos, Amazon and Yelp to offer countless user reviews, Craigslist to host classified ads, Facebook and Twitter to offer social networking to thousands of millions of internet users. The FTC regulates activity by doing investigation and report. For instance, Facebook recently received a record 5 billion fine last year for failure to comply with rules set by the FTC, but not because the company violated its social media regulations. The FTC penalty against Facebook was for violating customer privacy. Facebook and other Facebook and others are bounded by the same rules that most companies must follow, such as general agreed upon definition of business practice, truth in advertising, and so on. But industries like medicine, energy, and automotive have additional rules entire agency specified to them, but not so with social media companies.
Hello, I'm going to talk about our case study, Cambridge Analytica and Facebook with regards to regulating social media. guy called Christopher Wiley ended up becoming the whistleblower of this story when it broke in 2018 in The Guardian and the New York Times. He worked for a company called SEL, a London-based company, and they had contracts for defence forces, and their role was to, through social media, to identify vulnerable people that would be susceptible to radicalisation and to try and intervene to stop this from happening. Then a guy called Steve Bannon came on board with the company, and the company was bought out by a guy called Robert Mercer, and then one of their subsidiaries, they became Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica did a number of studies, or worked with the University of Cambridge, and they discovered that by looking at a person's Facebook profile, that you could gather a huge amount of data about, what type of person that is. You could build up a personality profile going by types of films that they liked or books that they've read. It's surprising the amount of information that can be gleaned from social media. As the saying goes, knowledge is power. After Steve Bannon came on board, Christopher Wiley started to notice that the company seemed to have had a change of direction. As opposed to, targeting vulnerable people that could be radicalised, they were instead using that information to target people maybe on the fringes of society who would be prone to conspiratorial thinking or paranoid ideation, which I suppose is the same as people that could be radicalised into radical groups. But instead, Cambridge Analytica set about to make it their purpose to manipulate these people to join the alt-right movement by using targeted ads on Facebook during the 2016 campaign. These targeted ads they'd build up a profile, and then they would target ads to get people to join groups, and then the groups would get together and they'd see a link on a screen to join a group or to join a discussion, and a person might think, this is completely random, but it was actually very, very orchestrated to bring these people together. I guess the main issue with what went on with Cambridge Analytica is the University of Cambridge wrote an app called This Is Your Digital Life, and it was basically a personality profile, but it went under a number of different guises, one of which being just simple online survey: what type of personality are you? And people, maybe somebody bored surfing the internet would click into this and think, oh yeah, let's see what kind of personality I am. Little did they know, well, we all know now that you're implicitly sharing your information by default with Facebook unless you opt out. So about 270,000 people downloaded this app, and the Facebook authorized this, by the way. They authorized this app to gather information on every single one of those people's in their friends list. So by the time you get to the end of this, about 270,000 people downloaded the app and took the survey, but it's estimated that the information of up to 87 million users in the US alone had their information shared, from pretty general things, what types of films they like, movies, but also to the location. And this is a huge amount of information. You can draw up so many different, tell so many different things from a person from their Facebook profile. And this is the crux of it. This was then used in the 2016 Trump campaign to basically spread disinformation, misinformation, to suit his narrative. So I'd just like to conclude by saying I hope this presentation has made it clear to you on what types of regulation is needed. And then there's the old ethical argument of, regulation versus censorship. But I think in this case, it's clear to see that Facebook was clearly lacking, and they should have done more to protect people's personal data. But hey, at the same time, you remember, every time you go on Facebook or one of these social media platforms, you're sharing your information and your details with them. Just remember all the disclaimers, all the boxes that you have to tick to go into these organizations. So my advice is to check all your apps and permissions. Thank you very much.